Thank you. Well, we have a very special guest today with us in the Wilton's top floor studios, and I'm delighted to be with the Right Honourable Sir John Major, who is the most fantastic music hall aficionado. Some of you might know him as a former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, but we know him very well here as the great knowledge of music hall. Welcome to Wilton's.
Great pleasure to be here, Frances.
Now, I've got a question to ask you because you have written the most fantastic book. I don't know if you can see it on here. We have our own signed copy here for the Wilton's archive, and it's a wonderful, wonderful story. But there's a very special theatre on the front cover. Would you like to tell us about the choice of this
Well,
picture?
the choice of this picture, it is, of course, Wilton's Theatre, which was very famous, built in 1859, existed for a couple of years or so, for a couple of decades or so, and it was a very famous theatre. And this is a very evocative picture of a small boy looking at music hall in one of the most famous theatres of them all. So I thought it was a very appropriate front cover.
Thank you. Well, it is a great honour. And in fact, you're connected to us again because whilst you were Prime Minister, you set up a very special fund, which is actually helping to save old buildings and theatres, and that's the Heritage Lottery Fund.
Well, I set up the lottery for reasons like this. There were all sorts of things that are crucial to the lifestyle of most of the people in this country, and yet they were never going to get funded by any government because health, defence, education, social services all came in front of it. So the purpose of the lottery was to raise large sums of money to help, in this case, the heritage of show business and this particular theatre, but sport, the arts, and all sorts of other things. And I'm delighted to say I learned just yesterday that they have now actually spent something over £30 billion on good causes in the last 15 years.
That's extraordinary.
It is extraordinary.
That is extraordinary.
No,
Great thing. Oh, well,
I'm delighted you got some of
yeah,
it.
yes, exactly. A very different conversation otherwise. No, no, we're very delighted. As you can see, it's a work in progress at Wilton's, and I think in about a year and a half's time we'll be a fully functioning music hall again.
You've restored the famous mahogany bar.
Yes.
Which was one of the very famous bars of music hall throughout its life.
Absolutely, and I think it was more famous than the poor music hall it's attached to, actually. It had some quite wonderful visitors from all over the world at regular intervals, day and night. I don't think our licensing officer would ever let us operate in the same way again.
No, well, you had a checkered career.
We have had a checkered career. I would like to just ask you a few questions because you've given a wonderful talk today to our audiences. One of the questions is, or one of the requests is that you spoke so beautifully about how you learned about your own musical heritage. Could you repeat that for us again, about how you learned as a young boy?
When my father was in his early 80s, well, in his mid-70s to early 80s, he was very sick and he was pretty much bedridden and he was blind. And I was a small boy. He was 65 when I was born. I was a small boy. And I would sit beside his bed as his audience. And he would talk about the 30 years he and his first wife, and my mother, his second wife, had actually spent in music hall. And lots of people, when he was very sick, used to begin to visit him. And they were people who had appeared on stage with him 40, 50 years earlier. And they sat round the bed and they sang the old songs. They argued about who had the greatest songs. Was it Florrie Ford? Was it Champion? Who was it? Was Mari Lloyd the best? Who was the funniest, Dan Leno or Little Titch? And they had all these wonderful conversations, and they relived their past, and they just came alive beside that bed. Prosperity hadn't touched the lives of many of them, and they certainly had very little when they called to see my father. But you could tell an inner glow reappeared when they remembered the moments in their life that had meant most to them, which was when they were performing on stage so many years earlier. And I absorbed all that.
It's really wonderful. It's so beautiful, and you realise that these kinds of communities and these sorts of artists, there's so much heart and passion in what they did that they become like a great family, and it's quite an honour to know that we're vaguely connected to that. I hope that, or I feel that a lot of entertainment we get today is lacking in this kind of heart.
Well, the great thing about, I mean, you mentioned a family, and of course that's very appropriate, because the great success of the music hall artists was that they came from the community. And they represented to the community what a successful life could be. And they performed to people from their own neighborhood and much wider as they became famous. But they came from those communities and they communicated to them. And they produced a parody of what their lives were like. And it did draw people together in a truly extraordinary way.
And the work of the British Music Hall Society, because it is their 50th birthday this weekend, and we're celebrating all the work they've done and their wonderful archives, do you think it's important that we still keep preserving this kind of music hall heritage, or do you think we should be trying to actually diversify and bring it back out again?
Well, I'd love to see more of it, but I think that there are two component parts to that. Firstly, should we preserve it? Yes, we should. Victorian Music Hall and Edwardian Music Hall, but particularly Victorian Music Hall, was absolutely emblematic of the Victorian age. It was the entertainment of the nation. No television, no radio, no records. It was the entertainment of the nation. And you learn a great deal about how people lived, from the entertainment they have, the songs they sang, which reflected their way of life. And it is as crucial a part of history as the learning the dates of wars or the names of kings and prime ministers. So I think it is crucial that it is preserved. As for extending it, well, I hope I'm not looking at this through rose-tinted glasses, but I think there is a bit of a comeback for music hall. There is a bit of a comeback for the demand for live entertainment in which there's an empathy across the boards between audience and performers, which for all the great entertainment offered on film and television, you don't have. And so I'd love to see it, and I think the restoration of Wilton's, in which there will be a lot of music hall, is absolutely marvellous. I'm thrilled it's happened.
Oh, thank you very much, Zoe. And I've got a little argumentative question to ask you, because I know that you're well equipped to deal with this kind of question. You said earlier that, somebody asked you, why do you think music hall died? I personally don't think music hall ever did die. I think it's very much around us in everything that we see, but you just perhaps don't recognise it. And one of the arguments you said is because of the microphone. And I'd like to say, I think it's because music hall artists got a little complacent because they knew what they did worked and they just kept peddling it out and they didn't diversify quick enough. They didn't move with the times.
I think there's something in that. And there's a whole series of reasons why music hall faded. The arrival of the microphone, the arrival of film, perhaps the degree of repetitive entertainment, as you say. And of course, fashions changed with the Great War. And a new generation demanded something different, and jazz appeared, which took over so much. One forgets now how much that took over things, just an immediate post-war period. And then the great giants of music hall, Mari Lloyd in 1922, Little Titch, I think, in 1928, they died. And the legend of music hall began to fade away. Though even today, there are performers who are pure music hall. Roy Hudd, of course, who does so much for the Music Hall Society, Bruce Forsyth, Barbara Windsor, Freddie Davis. There are so many. You could transport them back 150 years, put them smack in the middle of Victorian Music Hall, and they would be entirely at home, and the audience would be entirely at home with them. So in that sense, it hasn't died. It's got a legacy. And it has also cast its shadow, its benevolent shadow, in so many other ways in terms of show business. So to that extent, it hasn't died, and I hope, frankly, that it never does.
So John Major, you're brilliant. Thank you so much for spending this time with us, and look forward to welcoming you back to Wilton's.
It won't be too long, I hope. I shall look forward to it.
Thank you.
Thank you.